That man, that young man, I forgive him. I forgive him because it was what Christ did and is what Charlie would do. The answer to hate is not hate. The answer we know from the gospel is love, and always love. Love for our enemies and love for those who persecute us.
That was an emotional moment yesterday from the widow of Charlie Kirk during the memorial service for her late husband. Charlie, of course, quoting from Matthew, where Jesus commands us to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Monday, September 22nd. With us, we have co-host of our fourth hour, staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire, U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC News and host of The Rest is Politics podcast, Katty Kay, New York Times opinion columnist David French, and Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, historian Jon Meacham. So tens of thousands of people, just an absolutely packed arena, including the president and top administration officials, gathered in Arizona yesterday to remember the late conservative activist Charlie Kirk. NBC News senior correspondent Garrett Haake has all the details.
President Trump closing out a day of prayer and politics at the Arizona memorial service for assassinated conservative activist Charlie Kirk.
None of us will ever forget Charlie Kirk, and neither now will history.
The president's speech following remarks by members of his cabinet and inner circle, including an emotional Vice President J.D. Vance, who was close to the 31-year-old Kirk.
I have talked more about Jesus Christ in the past 2 weeks than I have my entire time in public life. And that is an undeniable legacy of the great Charlie Kirk.
God bless all of you.
Kirk's widow, Erica, who will succeed her husband as CEO of Turning Point, the conservative youth organization he founded, speaking emotionally about her husband.
But I will miss him. I will miss him so much because our marriage and our family were beautiful. They still are.
Erica Kirk saying she would not weigh in on whether the government should seek the death penalty for her husband's accused killer, telling the New York Times, quote, "I do not want that man's blood on my ledger." FBI Director Kash Patel posting a lengthy update on the investigation into alleged shooter Tyler Robinson, promising the FBI is, quote, "meticulously investigating theories and questions about the case, including some internet-fueled conspiracy theories." While back in Glendale, tens of thousands of attendees packed State Farm Stadium, home of the NFL's Arizona Cardinals, many lining up overnight to secure seats amid extensive security measures.
Oh, this is amazing. We love Charlie so much and all the work that he did in this country.
We're coming here to appreciate him and appreciate what he spoke for.
That's NBC's Garrett Haake with that report. David French, you and I actually grew up in this sort of cultural background. We attended, I don't know exactly what church services you attended, but I suspect they were a lot like mine. And so none of this sounded foreign to us. It was certainly interesting, though, the mix of religion, politics, and as Donald Trump himself said, sort of this old-time tent revival feel. I was curious and been curious. What were your thoughts? Of course, moving beyond just the absolute horrible human tragedy of all of this, and still, I must say, all these weeks later, still so extraordinarily hard to come to terms with that somebody going around talking to college students would be assassinated this way.
Yeah, when you saw Erica Kirk speak, one of the first things that I thought was this is one of the most beautiful things that I've seen, heartbreaking, heartrending. And that's what Christianity is what she did right there in front of all of those people, actually forgiving Charlie Kirk's killer, talking about the sacrifice of Jesus and Jesus forgiving his killers. I mean, this is the heart and the core of what Christianity is, and to see it right there in that way. And I think it also helped bring home to people that we're having political arguments and political fights surrounding all of this, but at the end of the day, she lost a husband, her kids lost a father, people lost a friend. I mean, this was a horrific, horrific event. And so I think that moment was singularly powerful in communicating the gravity of the loss and also what Christianity is. But then you had all of this complexity of Trump getting up there and behaving in a very, very, very different way, also to cheers. And so what you saw here in a lot of ways was this complexity of this MAGA world and the complexity of this MAGA movement, that there are people within it and people who express ideas within it who they're beautiful, wonderful people who are caught up in this movement. And then there is this other side that is so directly contradictory of the message that Erica Kirk shared. And so that's one thing that struck me. You know, when I watch this, I know from my own home in Tennessee, where people have just been cut to the core by Charlie Kirk's loss. And I think you could see that. You could see that in the memorial. And then you could also see this other side of it all when Donald Trump got up to speak, when Donald Trump started to address the issue. And, you know, that is in many ways the complexity of all this that we saw in front of our eyes.
Well, it really was. I mean, there were so many times that we would hear things that, again, sounded like it could come straight out of Baptist Student Union in Tuscaloosa when I would go there in college, or, you know, the Baptist churches I grew up in. They're talking about love and grace and forgiveness, loving our enemies, praying for those who persecute us. But then with at least the politicians, John Meacham, and the people who worked for politicians, you had another beat. It was, Charlie taught us to forgive, but, and then it would be like, oh, this is all the left wing's fault, or, oh, these are people who hated and mocked and ridiculed. There were two beats, and it did sound, when the politicians got up there, sounded very discordant. Instead of celebration of a life and talking about Jesus's words and Jesus's commandments of us to forgive others, there at times there was another tone that was taken. So I found that to be discordant. But I'm curious what you certainly could go back to the early 1800s, John, and find examples of politics and religion mixing. So this has happened before. I'm just curious, what were your thoughts yesterday as you watched this?
What I was thinking was it would be too glib. And I think there are going to be a lot of folks, I would imagine, on the center and left of American politics who will be reflexively uncomfortable with what unfolded yesterday. What I would urge is not to be reflexively uncomfortable, but to take each of those who addressed that audience, addressed the nation, addressed in many cases the world, and take their words on their own merits and in their own context. There's going to be a lot of talk. I'm sure David's email box is full of people seeking to understand this thing called Christian nationalism. But there was a feeling, particularly with Mrs. Kirk, that it was something that had a genuine, what appeared to be a genuinely religious component. And then came the president, who spoke the way President Trump speaks, and that should be considered on its merits as well. But I'm a big believer, as I think you are, Joe, that we must separate church and state. There's a religious case for that, by the way. Originally, that notion of a wall of separation between church and state, which was an image that came from Richard Hooker, an Anglican divine, came through Thomas Jefferson, and then the Supreme Court picked the image up in the 20th century. The initial point of the wall was not to protect the state from the church, but the church from the state. The original phrase was that the garden of Christ's church should not be damaged by the state. That said, religion and politics, because they're both about people, they're both about human nature, they're both about our sense of the origins, course, and destiny of life, religion and politics can't be separated. They have to be managed and marshaled. And so what we have here is, I think, particularly in the moment where Mrs. Kirk, in imitation of Christ, forgave the assassin. The only other example of that I can think of offhand in public life is when John Paul II visited his own assailant, which is a remarkable analogy and standard. Mm-hmm. I don't dismiss this, I would say to my liberal friends who might be uncomfortable with some of the imagery. There are worse things than. Oh my gosh! Yes,
yeah, and I will say, David French, it was, and again, if Pope John Paul II did that, we actually talked to Reverend Al Sharpton, who was stabbed in an assassination attempt. He forgave his assailant. That's a command from Jesus. We saw it again yesterday with Erica. But I will say, no, I will tell you, most of what I heard yesterday, David, was very affirming. And there were even people who got up who surprised me in what they said, talking about we're not to judge others. We're to focus on ourselves. We are to heal ourselves. We are to become better ourselves. It reminds me where Jesus says, the Sermon on the Mount, why are you looking in the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a plank in your own? Take care of yourself. So no, I thought until the politicians and the people who work for politicians got up there and tried to leverage it for their own good, I thought those who knew Charlie Kirk and loved Charlie Kirk and worshiped with Charlie Kirk and grew up with Charlie Kirk and lived with Charlie Kirk, I thought their messages were very affirming and straight out of the Gospels. I always talk about the red letters. You know, don't take me back to Nahum. Don't take me back to some singular verse in Leviticus. Like, look at the red letters, see how Jesus fulfilled the law. That's where we are. If we are Christians, that's where we are to live. That's where we are to sit. That's where we are to look at the world when we treat others. And I found overwhelming majority of what was said yesterday, not by the politicians and not by the people who work for the politicians, not by the bureaucrats. I found some very positive, very affirming things said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think if you looked at that, if you watched that, you could see why so many of us were saying, look, don't turn this person into just a symbol where all you do after this horrible, evil act, all you do is debate his legacy or debate the politics of it all. Why can't you take a moment, take a beat, and just mourn his loss and mourn what happened here? Because as soon as politics gets involved, everyone is reduced to the caricature of themselves, either the worst things that somebody ever said if you're on the other side, or you become the best things, you're only the best things you ever did or said on the opposing side, on the other side. And so this moment where you actually got to see people who are very close to him talk about him, I think this is something that was important for Americans who tuned in, who watched, to begin to just understand and appreciate the scope of the human loss here, that this is a human being who is lost, who, like anybody else who's lost in horrible, evil acts, had a family, had dimensions to their personality that people couldn't see in public or people couldn't see outside of the family. And I think that was a very, very, very important moment because it's so distressing how quickly this entire argument moved to politics, moved to his best words or his worst words. Look, we've got a lot of people who are still in politics we can argue with. This is a moment when you mourn.